Welcome to the Indian Council of World Affairs, India's oldest foreign policy think tank.
Many people interested in foreign policy have told me when they come to the Indian Council of World Affairs in Sapru House, they feel a great sense of affinity with this institution because this was where the serious study of international relations in India all began.
The ICWA was set up by a small group of public intellectuals some years before our independence because they felt it important that India have an independent perspective on international affairs. Since then, the ICWA has gone from strength to strength, and it has been a long journey, almost 75 years. One particular milestone in that journey was in 2001, when the Indian Parliament passed an act declaring the ICWA to be an institution of national importance. We thus became a publicly funded independent think tank. Our governing council is headed by the Vice President of India, and the External Affairs Minister is its Vice President. We have three focus areas. The first is research, which is carried out by an in-house faculty. Very rigorous research on different parts of the world, encompassing the domain of area studies.
The Council has been very proactive in conducting dialogue and discussion on African affairs and India-Africa relations in order to promote an understanding on African affairs in India, an Indian perspective on Africa, given the priority that now Africa has in Indian foreign policy.
Within the Council, we have a renewed focus on Latin America and the Caribbean region. So we're looking through our studies to find new areas of cooperation such as renewable energy, climate change and the space technology.
Interacting with leading experts, diplomats, media persons and academicians has helped me nurture my research further.
We recently had the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook, which has a lot of convergence with the India's own Indo-Pacific construct.
The learning curve at the Council has been tremendous, and it provides a strong foundation for my future research.
The second is policy. Because we are a think tank, and being close to policy, commenting on policy, and helping formulate policy is an essential part of our functioning.
I think in the new age, what we're seeing much more of is that people want to be involved in foreign policy thinking. They want to have a voice. Now, this is where ICWA comes in.
This is the platform where I, for many years, have come and interacted with the best in the world.
ICWA provides a valued platform for visiting foreign dignitaries to interact with informed Indian audiences. The third is outreach. This is most important because of our role as a public-funded independent think tank, and we carry this out by associating ourselves with as wide an audience in India as is possible. Colleges, universities, other think tanks, and of course, with similar institutions elsewhere in the world.
What I would call the democratization of Indian foreign policy, that it has moved to distant corners of the country. It is no longer a preserve of Delhi.
ICWA has a robust publications program which includes papers by the in-house faculty, invited papers and commentaries, and books on foreign affairs by not only former diplomats and established academics but also by upcoming scholars. Our journal, India Quarterly, is being published since 1945. ICWA's publications are also being translated into various Indian languages. What is ICWA's role as we move into the future? The vision of the institution is to stay abreast of all the momentous changes taking place in the domain of foreign policy. New areas are emerging. There are strategic technologies, there is climate change, there is artificial intelligence, and there is cyber security. How can our research faculty and the audiences that come here be better informed about developments in these areas? How can we write and formulate research papers to give policy inputs that help in government policy formulation? These are the emerging challenges for ICWA and form a part of our vision for the future.
Good afternoon, everyone. on behalf of the Indian Council of World Affairs, I welcome you all to today's book discussion on the book titled The Indian Civil Service and Indian Foreign Policy, 1923 to 1961. Today's session will be chaired by Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao, former Foreign Secretary of India. Among the panelists, we have the author of the book, Dr. Amit Das Gupta, who is a senior researcher based in Germany. Next, we have Dr. Anupam Ray, Joint Secretary in the PP&R division of the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. We have with us Professor Madhavan Palat, who is a historian and editor of the selected works of Nehru. We have Dr. Rudra Chaudhury, Director, Carnegie, India. And last, we have Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh, author and foreign affairs analyst. With this, may I now request the chair to conduct the proceedings. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Vivek, and thank you to the ICWA for inviting me to moderate this session and for holding this panel discussion on what is a wonderful new book by Dr. Amit Das Gupta on the Indian Civil Service and Indian Foreign Policy from 1923 to 1961. I also extend a very warm welcome to the panelists, the very distinguished panelists for our discussion today. I look forward to a very thought-provoking and illuminating discussion on Amit's book. I've had the opportunity these 2 days to browse through Amit's book, and I'd like to just make a few remarks before inviting the panelists to start their discussion, and in fact asking Amit also to introduce his book. Let me say this is a wonderful history, and in the course of reading it, you discover that what we call policy was not really Nehru's concept alone. Several cerebral minds contributed their ideas and perspectives to its formulation. The three protagonists in this story, Sir Girija Bajpai, Mr. KPS Menon, and Mr. Subhimal Dutt, developed distinct world views conditioned by their exposure to various defining events in the pre-independence phase of India's history, views that were realist, particularly in the case of Bajpai and Dutt, but also strongly anti-communist and rooted in knowledge and experience gleaned over their bureaucratic in what is termed the Brotherhood of the Indian Civil Service. Unlike Nehru, Bajpai particularly was clear, and this quote really appealed to me, that sentiment must serve, not master, the national interest, unquote. It's interesting also, as the reader discovers, that the global perspectives of these worthy gentlemen were gleaned not entirely in the execution of Britain's great game, but looking after the interests of Indian labour and immigrants in far-flung corners of the then empire. One of the triumvirate, KPS Menon, had a fascinating career span that encompassed Indians abroad, but also as a member of the Indian political service, travels, one may even call them explorations, that took him across India's northern periphery and frontiers into Chinese Xinjiang and also into the heart of China as it was riven by Japanese invasion and the travails of a bitter fratricidal civil war. I remember KPS Menon's sojourn in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, particularly fascinating. I regard it particularly fascinating since I served 2 postings there myself. I found the observation about radical Sinhalese politicians and future prime ministers like Dudley Senanayake and Solomon Bandaranaike targeting not the British and Europeans on the island as foreign, but the Indian indentured labour in the tea gardens as foreign elements requiring to be removed from the island as the movement for Ceylonization in what they felt was a Sinhalese and Buddhist nation gathered strength. I found that particularly noteworthy because I think much of that climate persists. As our author presciently observes, issues, attitudes, actors, and problems of the 1930s were those of the 1940s and thereafter. They are 20th century problems carried over into our current century. I hope all of you can hear me properly. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Maybe the others can mute themselves, those who haven't. Nehru's opinion of the ICS in the pre-independence years was dismissive. Their conformism, as he called it, came in for criticism. He felt ICS officers had fixed minds, wholly unsuited to a progressive environment. But power taught him more responsibility, and he learned to work with these very officers he had once derided. I also found Bajpayee's tenure in Washington as Agent General during the war years a matter of interest. Why did he accept the posting there when it was certainly a demotion from the positions of very high responsibility he had held in India previous to this? His star seemed eclipsed during those years, even despite the access to President Franklin Roosevelt, whose nickname for him was Bagpipe. He was seen by the political class in India, particularly in the Congress, as spearheading propaganda against Indian freedom in America. For Bajpayee, those years must have been undeniably difficult. It took independence and his return to India and his innate excellence as an experienced and highly capable officer to gain the confidence and trust of Nehru and remaining loyal to him despite their differences of opinion on key issues like China and Tibet, where Bajpayee urged the utmost caution, preparedness, and a quid pro quo approach. Thereafter, there was no looking back until his ill health and premature death ended the contributions of this remarkable individual to defining the national interest and India's place in the world. Ever rational, ever calculating, his views on the United States and its role in world affairs, that, I quote, state of mind which seeks to clothe fear of the unpleasant in the garb of idealism, unquote, and the lack of moderation of moral pretensions and recognition that other nations, quote again, may also have some contribution to make to a code of international relations based on justice, unquote, I found very compelling and clearly enunciated. Also, his views on Kashmir, I think, were infused with a heavy dose of realism, preferring a sustainable solution over dogma and emotion, so that India was freed from a conflict that has dragged her down for 7 decades, diverting resources from the tasks of national development. Each of these 3 men who formed the nucleus of this history was different from the other, but they seemed to reinforce each other to create a force for the greater good of Indian foreign policy in its nascent post-independence phase. Menon and Dutt were deeply admiring of Nehru, almost worshipful of their prime minister. Menon was an ardent supporter of Indian freedom and independence, privately, as his diaries indicate, although during British rule he functioned clearly as a member of the establishment on his various postings, including in China. It's interesting to see how both Bajpayee and Menon disliked Krishna Menon, the blue-eyed protege of the prime minister, for what they saw as an amateurish and untrained approach to diplomacy, potentially damaging to the national interest, making more enemies than friends. Subimal Dutt emerges from this history as its unsung hero. In many ways, after Bajpayee's departure from the Foreign Office in 1952, Dutt was the voice of sober reflection and judgment when it came to issues of critical importance of foreign and security policy. You witness the same pragmatism, absence of dogma, and a distrust of communism in both these key actors. During the crisis in Hungary in 1956, Dutt's assessments differed from those of KPS Menon, by then India's ambassador to the Soviet Union, for whom the Russians could do no wrong, and whose views, in Dutt's opinion, lacked objectivity. Here again, like Bajpayee, Dutt's loyalty to Nehru was steadfast, even if he was uncomfortable about the Prime Minister's approach to the Soviet Union and his suspension of disbelief. Both Bajpayee and Dutt stand out as icons of sheer professionalism and excellence. My takeaways from the book were that aptitude, precision, and finesse count in diplomacy, together with an openness of mind and curiosity about the world. On paying attention to detail, Sir Girja's son, the late Ambassador K.S. Bajpayee, used to recount this delightful story of his father tearing pages about the Statute of Westminster from his son's Oxford textbook on British constitutional history, from which he was studying for an exam that very week to check and validate a quotation he was making in a speech in London. Girija Bajpai was known for his prodigious memory, strong strategic and communication skills, his mastery of the English language, even if he was accused of narcissism and self-centeredness. For him, the restrained phrase and invincible logic were far superior to ornate rhetoric. It is said that the coolness of diplomats should be the coolness of reason, and Bajpai was an exemplar of this school. Bajpai, Menon, and Dutt also fitted George Kennan's definition that diplomats must be gardeners, not mechanics, in their approach to world affairs. They personified in their functioning that diplomacy is more than a science, it is a finely honed art. So finally, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Amit Das Gupta once again for this wonderful research that he's conducted into the origins of the Indian Foreign Service and the personalities that molded the institution that we are today. My warm congratulations to you. And now we can begin our discussion. Vivek, would you like to proceed? Shall we ask Amit to speak now?
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Das Gupta can speak.
Dr. Das Gupta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I think you have summarized my book much better than I can do. I would like to start with expressing my gratitude for the invitation here, such a prominent forum, in putting together a panel with such distinguished and competent participants. And I would like to add there that we are dearly missing two persons here who have contributed to the book at large and supported my research over many years. One is, Madam has mentioned him already, K.S. Bajpai, the son of Sir Girija Shankar Bajpai, who passed away last summer, and the second, Professor Hari Vasudevan from Calcutta University, both victims of the pandemic, unfortunately. I would like to start with some words on the origins of the book and how I came to write it. So I authored a biography of India's longest-serving Foreign Secretary, Shubhamal Dutt, and while I was aware of his role after independence, in the context of my work, I discovered that he had been agent in Malaya in 1941, that he had been working for a department looking after Indians overseas, and he had a mentor and boss, G.S. Bajpai. So it all sounded like Indians pursuing foreign policy in the colonial period, which is against any pattern we know. A colony lacks sovereignty, and per se cannot have any indigenous foreign policy. That's the rule. And that's why in historiography, the MEA is usually seen as the successor of the Colonial External Affairs Department, which, however, had mostly European personnel, and they were all leaving in 1947. So there's not much of a tradition, apart from, Madam has mentioned already, KPS Menon. And somehow everyone takes for granted that in 1947, India started into independence with experienced and trained diplomats. Indeed, this is the exception from the rule and not the rule at all. I believe my book has a somewhat novelty approach in writing part history of Indian foreign policy, not focusing on politicians, but on the often overlooked apparatus. So I've chosen these three key figures who were all extraordinary officers of the Indian Civil Service. First of all, because they formed the troika of secretaries on top of the Ministry of External Affairs between 1948 and 52. The Secretary General was the mastermind, Bajpai, who attended his first international conference as early as 1921. He is the key figure in the colonial period, and he's setting up the ministry and the IFS with independence. The other two are his discoveries from the colonial period. KPS Menon, first posting abroad in 1929, then a short stint in Bajpai's department during the war, agent general in China, and then from 1948, the first Indian foreign secretary. He exercises his peak influence during his 9 years as ambassador in Moscow. Later, he's also posted in Beijing. The third, Shri Madat, is the one who has no genuine interest in foreign affairs. It's rather coincidence. He comes in touch with Bajpai and is posted abroad. And in 1947, he is appointed Commonwealth Secretary for the man to run the machine, the apparatus. And rather surprisingly, after his appointment to Foreign Secretary in October 55 until April 61, he turns out to be a foreign policy expert with very pronounced ideas. His career ends with a short return from retirement as High Commissioner to Bangladesh in 1970s. Their business are the Indians overseas, and these are mostly underprivileged Indians from the South. And for decades, nobody has cared about them much. And this changes with the Gandhian campaigns in South Africa and some scandals in Fiji. So you know that the British broke many of the promises given during the First World War. No dominion status for India, but they established a department looking after those Indians abroad. And very soon, it was a very Indian department in terms of the officials who were working there. They looked after mostly the legal status and fair wages for Indians overseas. This department has a most misleading name, Department of Education, Health and Lands. So it had very little to do actually with education, health and lands. It's properly named Department for Indian Overseas only in the 1940s, when that policy doesn't play much of a role. Why that strange name? I believe it's a cover-up, because there is already a colonial foreign department, and these two are rivaling, and it shouldn't be too obvious. I provided 4 case studies: South Africa, East Africa, Ceylon and Malaya, and I'm not going into details here, of course. To summarize that experience of about 20 years of international diplomacy, it's often bilateral diplomacy without any involvement from London, in particularly South Africa and Ceylon, which seems to qualify as proper foreign policy. And because British India has no possibility to exercise any hard power, there's a focus on soft power. That means personal diplomacy, a focus on legitimate rights, or to say in Gandhian words, to convince, not to coerce the adversary. So this is very much a Gandhian policy, and there's no coincidence that there are so many parallels with the independence movement. During the Second World War, as Madam has said already, Bajpai falls from grace, is transferred to Washington, and for years is struggling for his status and competences. And ironically, Bajpai has no sympathies for the independence movement, but he fights the fight of India and Indians for the status of British India in his own, of course. The positive experience he takes along, besides all the depression, is that he is involved in almost everything around the creation of the United Nations and the new global post-war order. The major change comes about with the interim government in September 1946, and the first to benefit is KPS Menon, who for a while functions as Nehru's foreign policy advisor. He is functioning as secretary to the delegation to the United Nations. But surprisingly, when independence comes in sight, Menon willingly leaves towards China again, is not building up a position at home like so many others do. And even more surprising, nobody is keen to keep him in Delhi. At the moment, he returns in April 1948 only, when major decisions are taken already. Bajpai's career, it had seemed, was over because he had no friends with the Congress Party. And the change comes in December 1946, when Nehru, after 3 months with the interim government, realizes he does not have much of an idea how to shape foreign affairs. He doesn't have the personnel to implement his ideas. He needs experts. And the very expert is, of course, Bajpai, who is called back to establish the Ministry of External Affairs and the Indian Foreign Service. So the very Indian ICS officer is given a key role once again in independent India. And among the first thing Bajpai does, he calls back Shri Madat as Commonwealth Secretary, a reliable, totally loyal administrator, keeping his back free. So what does it mean to bring back Bajpai? It means to bring back the ICS. Madam has said already the ICS was anathema to the Congress, the brown Englishmen who are collaborating with the colonial power. This is one aspect. The second is Vajpayee's realism, which was not in line with Nehruvian non-alignment on many fields. So, you know that Nehru stands, of course, for non-alignment, but also idealist ideas like the betterment of mankind. Vajpayee, on the contrary, represents the realist school, and to my knowledge, he's the only Indian of relevance who has authored a concept around the possibilities of a foreign policy of independent India that dates from early 1946. So his basic assumption is that India, notwithstanding its size, is a weak country that needs to be industrialized, and it needs strong partners. That means alignment against Nehruvian non-alignment, and there are three partners, possible ones, the great powers. The US, however, are unreliable. The Soviet Union will undermine Indian democracy. That leaves, by exclusion, the United Kingdom, now as partner on eye level. This is very much counterpoint to Nehru's foreign policy, and even more the conclusion. Madam has quoted already that sentiment must serve, not master, national interest. If you look into some decisions of Nehru during his term as Prime Minister, it's clearly vice versa. What influence does Vajpayee exercise during his 5 years as Secretary General? And I found it's remarkable little influence, because Nehru is the first superior he cannot pull along. And Vajpayee has free rule during the colonial period. This ends with Nehru, and they have differences of opinion. It's Kashmir, it's the boundary issue with China, and it's the general Indian standing in the Cold War. Vajpayee tends towards the West, and Nehru, has sympathies for the communist countries. But there's never an open conflict, because Vajpayee always gives in and does not try to do anything behind Nehru's back, apart from one story that he tries to forge a military alliance with Burma, and when Nehru comes to know about it, he immediately cancels the effort, typically. More influential, surprisingly, are Vajpayee's heirs, as they have called him. Subhimal Das, very much in Vajpayee's tradition as a realist, and his focus soon is on the boundary dispute with China, and he manages to pull Nehru along, unlike Vajpayee had done, and he counts on negotiations instead of vague hopes and collecting evidence, and this leads into the famous summit with Zhou Enlai in April 1960 and the Indian White Books on the boundary dispute. Menon, on the other hand, is posted in Moscow, where he sees everything positive. His influence comes via his friendship with Nehru and their shared common intellectual interests, so he gives the Soviet Union a better image than deserved, and is certainly one of the architects of Indo-Soviet friendship. Coming to an end, there are four aspects I would like to highlight in very short. So we see in the apparatus a strong realist school with a focus on soft power and a Gandhian tradition. The obvious question, is this old wine in new skins? I would say no, because realism is no British concept. We all know the Arthashastra, so it's a concept in foreign policy that is not linked with any particular nation or policy. Are these the brown Englishmen who have betrayed India and taken care that this is not a truly post-colonial society, as they have been blamed by the independence movement? I hold they are actually fighting for the emancipation of Indians, and they are indeed subverting the empire by the demand for equal status for all citizens, independent from color of skin. The links with Congress are not too visible, but they definitely helped the Indian case before 1947, and they give Indian diplomacy a professional touch thereafter. The last point, because we have Madam Rao on the panel, is the discovery of the impact of women in diplomacy, which is coincidence in the 1930s because the wife of an Indian agent in South Africa turns out to be the big success of diplomacy in South Africa because she convinces as an educated, distinguished woman. And the story continues with Nehru's decision in 1947 to open the IFS for women on principle. So it takes a little while, but we see many prominent women in Indian foreign affairs after 1947, all appointed at that moment, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, Mridula Saurabai, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, and others. Altogether, these points together, it's Indian diplomacy right from 1947 is pretty professional and it has a very modern image. And last, it's clearly Indian foreign policy without much British influence. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit, for those very interesting remarks. One thing that I did not mention when I spoke about your book was the focus you gave to the Department of Education, Health and Lands during the colonial period and the work that was done by some of our troika, by Mr. KPS Menon particularly and Subimal Dutt. Mr. Menon in Ceylon and Mr. Dutt in Malaya. And how, in many ways, that focus on the welfare of Indians abroad continues to be a core concern in our foreign policy to this day. So the precepts, the standards, and the precedents set by these pioneering men, Mr. Menon and Mr. Dutt in those days, can, I think, be very much of an illuminating guide for us even till this day. I myself, when I was first secretary in our mission in Colombo in the early 80s, did a lot of work with the plantation labor in the central highlands of Sri Lanka. And much of what you outline in your chapters concerning the work that was done in Ceylon and Malaya in those days seems so relevant and seems so, it echoes in what we do today, echoes a lot of what those concerns were in that period. And I like the line particularly that Delhi was not aware of being the sorcerer's apprentice in this work that was being done by these gentlemen in these far-flung corners of the empire, because demands for equal rights and fair wages outside the colony sooner or later had to bounce back to the subcontinent. I think that's extremely relevant and true. Yes, I agree with you that the professionalism of these gentlemen has set standards for our foreign service that we do well to emulate to this day. You spoke about women in diplomacy, and I think we should mention in this context, apart from, the very eminent women you mentioned, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, for instance, and Rajkumari Amrit Kaur and Mridula Saurabai. Ambassador C.B. Muthamma was the first woman to be recruited into the civil service after independence. And she was a career diplomat. And in her career, the struggles she, confronted and overcame, and the challenges, that she took on, spurred us on, younger women in the foreign service, gave us encouragement and inspiration. So I always call her our Rosa Parks, because she sat, we walked, and because we walked, the new generation of foreign service women run today. So I'd just like to bring that in too. Now I'd call upon Dr. Anupam Ray from the Ministry of External Affairs, who is a very old friend of mine and a trusted colleague in the days we worked together. Anupam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Ambassador Nirupama Rao, Ambassador Raghavan, my good friend Amit, my fellow panelists, some of whom I know and some of whom I know on Twitter. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this about this book. I must tell you that this is the first time that I'm speaking at such an event, and I must begin by saying that I wish I had written this book. I approach this book not just as a person who enjoys reading, who enjoys history. I approach it from the perspective of being a lifelong civil servant and a career diplomat. I approach it from being a part of the institution and the service that Amit has studied so carefully, and might I add, with such understanding and sympathy. Amit is an old friend. We first came to know each other a decade ago, more or less. This is my second stint in the policy planning division. In my first spell as a policy planner, a very short spell of a few months, I was introduced to Amit by my father's batchmate and former Foreign Secretary, Chris Srinivasan. Those who know Ambassador Srinivasan know that it is difficult to get a word of praise from him or a recommendation, unless it is more than very strongly deserved. I would have you know that Amit first came to me with a reference from the very formidable Ambassador Srinivasan. I deeply appreciated Amit's interest in the workings of the Indian Foreign Service and Indian diplomacy. The Indian Foreign Service is now 7 decades old. It has 2 generations of officers. The batch that will join in 2021 will be the 74th batch. It is an institution, one of the oldest in independent India. I do not know the exact numbers, but reckoning at the rate of 20 officers per year, about 1,500 officers would have been directly recruited to the service. For the first time in its history, it has more retired batches than serving. Approximately 36 batches have retired completely. Less than 33 batches are entirely in service. When I walk into the Foreign Secretary's office, once occupied by Ambassador Rao, and I think I walked into it twice in the first 20 years of my service, you have these series of succession boards. And in that, you see a list of, it's a sanctum sanctorum of our system. They contain the names of foreign secretaries and their predecessors. And the various names that this department was known by: the secret department, the political department, the foreign and political department, the foreign department, and so on. And names going back into the 18th, I wanted to go into the room today, but to see when the first name appeared. But it's sometime in the mid-19th century. The IFS is an old service, but the Ministry of External Affairs is the successor organization of an even older organization, of an even older organization. Whatever little I knew about these books, about the service, and about this department, came from books about the ICS, most frequently written by ICS officers themselves. I knew that Sir Girja Shankar Bajpai was Agent General in Washington. I knew that KPS Menon was Agent General in Chungking. I read KPS Menon's account of his overland journey to Chungking, borrowed from the Calcutta Club Library, on my father's membership when I was in college. In it, I read about British India's Consulate General in Kasgar. I first read about the Indian political service in Philip Mason's book, The Men Who Ruled India. If there ever was an advertisement about a profession, it is that book. It is a heady and exhilarating mix of writing about what was allegedly a superior group of men. Mason, as many of you probably know, was a pseudonym for Philip Woodruff, a former ICS man. Woodruff compared the ICS to the Platonic ideal of the guardians: highly educated, highly competent, highly intelligent, and principled. The ICS was supposed to be the closest in the world to an ideal ruling caste, and the Indian political service was supposed to be the best amongst them. It made a deep impression upon my deeply impressionable mind. I'm afraid, however, that I'm yet to find any serious writing about the Indian political service and what it did. KPS Menon's memoirs are one source. I recently read Once a Prince of Sarila by Narendra Singh Sarila, a former prince and an IFS officer who has written about his father's experience with British residents. There is a comparatively large volume of writing about the ICS itself, and a large volume of autobiographical writing by both British and Indian authors. I can think of John Beams and N.B. Bakshi, for instance. There's very little about the Indian political service, and Amit's is the first contemporary book I have read or heard about in this space. And Amit has crammed several books into this. It is an exploration of the lives of 3 ICS officers: Sir Girja Shankar Bajpai, KPS Menon, and Subimal Dutt. I think that itself is a novelty. I began by talking about how the IFS is an institution. It is, however, an institution with many shortcomings. One of its greatest shortcomings, and one which I fear will affect it negatively, is the absence of serious historical writing about the service. There are some exceptions, like today's host, Ambassador T.C.A. Raghavan, but he's the exception that proves the rule. I'm fairly certain that a vast majority of serving officers have not heard of the 3 main protagonists in this book. I'm certain that the vast majority of the service has very little of an idea about what the Indian political service and what it did, if they have any idea about it. There are memoirs, but there is almost no history, and memoirs cannot take the place of history. Our officers know very little about the past because there is very little writing about the institution. There is a growing volume of writing about theory and practice of international relations in India. I'm familiar with the writings of two of my co-panelists, Rudra Chaudhury and Zorawar Daulet Singh. They're fine intellectuals who have written with great skill and depth of knowledge. But I do feel that Amit's writing fills a critical gap, and therefore it's something which I'm grateful to you, Amit, for writing. There's a lot that is very impressive about this book. The depth of archival research is one such distinction. I have on numerous occasions in the past run into Amit during his trips to Delhi as he slaved away in the National Archives and in Teen Murti. I worked with him in obtaining access to our archives in the missions, in some of our missions, and I am delighted to note the results in the form of this book. Some of the cross-referencing in this book, such as the use of US archival information in the section on Sir Girja Shankar's Bajpayee's tenure in Washington, were eye-opening for me. The fact that Sir Girja Shankar met President Roosevelt, something which Ambassador Rao referred to, on several occasions is something I didn't even suspect that could have happened. The nature of his work in Washington, the existence of Hardeep Singh Malik, whose memoirs were published posthumously recently, in a parallel capacity. His interaction with Lord Halifax or Lord Irwin, then the British ambassador in Washington and earlier the Viceroy of India, are fascinating for a student of institutions and processes. I've also found the parts about the first political appointees very interesting. The sections on K.M. Panikkar, on Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, and on Krishna Menon are fascinating. The book gives details about the evolution of India's China policy. I mean, this is the part which I read about with the greatest interest, at a time when two transitions were underway simultaneously, from British India to independent India, and from Kuomintang to the Communist Party. So K.M. Panikkar's role and his views during the simultaneous transitions cannot but be interesting. Similarly, the details about our first three ambassadors in Washington, Mrs. Pandit, Dr. Radhakrishnan, and KPS Menon, and how they interacted with headquarters, and Mr. Menon's views on Russia are, I think, of great interest. Over the last year or two, a number of biographies of key Indian figures have, in the early years, have been published. Jairam Ramesh's biographies of P.N. Haksar and Krishna Menon, the bio of V.P. Menon, Amit's own work on Sobemal Dutt, and I have to add our host's work on Sapru House, have added to our understanding of the early years of our journey. You know, Dean Acheson wrote about being present at the creation. None of us here present were present at the creation of the Ministry of External Affairs in its current form, in an official capacity. I find the work on the initial concerns of our Foreign Office, the focus on the diaspora that Ambassador Menon talked about, and its DNA that came from the Department of Education, Health and Lands. It's not something I was aware of until I read this book. As someone who worked on the diaspora pretty extensively, I have to say that the journey that the diaspora has made over and the way that our work has changed, that is of great interest. The institution of Secretary General, which ended with, I think, Pandit Nehru, is also something interesting. In one of I tried to reconstruct. I mean, in one of the sections, Amit talks about people walking into the Secretary General's room in strict order of precedence and departing in that order. So from what I could gather, it was one Secretary General, two secretaries, the Foreign Secretary and the Commonwealth Relations Secretaries, and 3 Joint Secretaries. Compare that to today, when we have 5 secretaries and 40 Joint Secretaries. I mean, that itself is a statement. Finally, I'd like to end with 2 thoughts. One is that, of course, the various personality types which you have described with such skill, Amit, still exist today. And that itself I think, is historical in value. And lastly, I cannot but end in a sentimental note. I mean, I actually pushed this book out into a WhatsApp group which we have with younger officers. It's called the IFS Reading Room. And in that, I wrote that because of your work, officers like Subimal Dutt and KPS Menon and Sir Girja Shankar Bajpayee are not forgotten. They and their work are not forgotten. Perhaps historians in future will not forget the work that we have done. Thanks again, Amit. Thanks. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to participate in this.
Thank you, Anupam, for those hopefully illuminating remarks. And I think it is good for the service that we have people like you who focus on history, who want the younger generation to be educated about the past, because we cannot develop that hindsight that we require unless we are aware of that history. So yeah, that's really good to know. And you've also taken us through a fascinating promenade of the outstanding personalities who define the IFS as an institution, beyond the three of who are covered so extensively in Amit's book. In fact, I just saw an article by Kalol Bhattacharjee in The Hindu, who wrote about this journalist had come across obviously a purloined copy of the Directory of Services, the IFS Directory of Services from 1958. And that itself is a historical document, because this article talks about the prominent, the senior people in the ministry at that time, and the fact that there were only 2 women officers listed in that list. One, of course, was Miss the other was Meera Inamdar, Meera Sinha, later Meera Sinha, and then Meera Bhattacharjee, who went to China during the Mao years, learned Mandarin Chinese, and had to quit the service when she married a fellow officer, Sumul Sinha. But that's all history now. But yes, this knowledge of what went into the past of our institution, this hallowed institution, to which we're all so proud to belong, I think is essential. And thank you for throwing the light in your remarks also on that. Let me now invite Professor Madhavan Palat to make his remark. Professor Palat, the floor is yours. Professor Palat, I think you're muted, are you?
Is it all right now?
Yes.
Yeah, you can hear me. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nirupama, and welcome everybody. Amit, let me first of all thank you for our book. Immense work of research in the archives. And everybody else curses us for writing such detailed books with such detailed archival research. But this is exactly what it should be. And it taught me enormous amounts, and the insights were wonderful in every way. Now, having said all that, now let me get on to the principal thesis and my comments upon them. Your main point is, as you've reiterated, is that before 1947, an Indian foreign policy had been worked out. That is the policy that Indians in the ICS who were assigned to the colonies to deal with the Indians there. And they acquired all the experience of international diplomacy, worked out a policy for India, and that was the basis on which subsequent foreign policies were developed also. At least it provided a foundation of some kind. And you specifically make the point that there was a policy, a foreign policy for the colony before independence, which is exceptional, because it's not expected that a colony will have a policy, a foreign policy of its own. Now, I'd like to take issue with in my opinion, I don't think what they were doing was pursuing a foreign policy at all. They were conducting British imperial policy, And they were the agents of the British Empire to carry out that policy in these respective colonies. It has nothing to do with Indian foreign policy. It is entirely British foreign policy, imperial one, within the empire. The British were using Indians for the purpose, and it is perfectly reasonable to have done so, as far as the British were concerned. And if it is not Indian foreign policy, what on earth is it? And why were Indians being used for this purpose? First, Indians are the most presentable face of the British Empire in the colonies when you're dealing with other Indians. It makes sense to do so. This is one of the oldest strategies of all empires. You can go back to the Roman Empire, they use the Goths versus the Goths, the Jews versus the Jews. Chinese use the Mongols against the Mongolians. The Russians developed the Cossacks. The British did so here. The Ottomans, practically any empire you do so, you recruit the tribe that you have conquered. From the tribe you have conquered, you recruit agents to deal with the tribe. And this went on everywhere, and it happened here also. In that sense, it is typical of an empire. I don't think to do with an Indian policy. It may expose some Indians to international diplomacy and practice. It is the same with their membership or activities in the League of Nations, the ILO, and so on. They were carrying out British policies there. Even Hitler, let me remind you, used Jews to deal with ghettos, what is called the Judenrat. Exceptional Jews, I think. Would be the practice of government speak out and speak to both sides of their mouths. Now here they were supporting the welfare of Indians in the colonies against the wishes of the local governors and the local colonial administrations. And it seems as if it is developing the interests of Indians abroad, while they were suppressing the welfare of Indians in India itself. Now, this is again not very unusual. Many governments speak with different voices. It gives them a greater flexibility, in fact, to do so. I can cite any number of examples from history of how one department speaks differently from another. Typically, in our own case, the government of India, the colonial government of India, and the British Foreign Office spoke in different voices regularly about the question of the expansion of their Indian empire towards Central Asia. The same happened in Russia between the Foreign Ministry of External Affairs in Russia and the War Ministry. We know, of course, about American Department of State and Department of Defense, how frequently they speak differently. The third point, and this is the most important, this is why they used Indians there, I think, I'd like your comments on this, is that because the fate of Indians in the colonies had a powerful impact upon the Indians in India, and nationalism had made it an issue, to soften the impact of that, they sent Indians there and argued the Indian case. And that is the colonial government of India. Because they had to deal with the national movement here. Made good politics within India to do so. And Indian nationalism was by far the most powerful nationalism they had to face anywhere in the empire. And protecting India as the jewel of the crown made sense. They fought to lose a few of the colonies to protect the empire. Another has to do with formulating a policy or a vision about an independent India's foreign policy. That, I think, only came with Nehru, not from these people who had this very limited objective. And as you yourself have said, Nehru's policy towards the Indians there, I mean, of course you look after their welfare, you do support it. But the main point was to urge them to become good citizens of their countries and otherwise to support the whole of the decolonization process. In other words, nationalism generally. Before independence, none of the Indian activists supported local nationalisms, only the welfare of Indians, nothing more than that. The points you have made so well yourself. So when it came to making a foreign policy, it seems Nehru's the one who had to do it. It didn't come from them. The next big question is, why did Nehru choose the ICS and how did it happen? When the ICS were obviously the instruments of the British Empire, and Nehru himself was so disparaging about the civil servants, as we know from his autobiography. Now, you have suggested that Nehru had no policy and he had to turn to the ICS with their experience to formulate one. Now, that itself, I think, is putting it in extreme fashion. What we do have is that they had a lot of experience, but there's no evidence that you have given, I think, of their having a foreign policy vision. What you have suggested about Vajpayee's document in early 1946 is about how Vajpayee only could think in terms of the British Empire and no more. The USA is unreliable, the Soviet Union will make you a satellite, the British are the one you align with. In other words, Vajpayee almost wanted to continue with the empire, remain within it, in alignment with Britain. But the whole point of independence is to break away from it. And that is what Nehru was trying to do. But, of course, like a civil servant, he had to obey Nehru. And if it was such a visionary document and such an important policy document, why did Nehru not see it? You had expressed doubts as to whether Nehru had actually seen the document. Well, why? Vajpayee should have given it to him, surely. Given the nature of the recommendation he was making. But finally, really, why Nehru should have turned to the ICS is that there was no question of divided loyalties anymore. They were Indian, they were patriotic, and there was no question of any of them challenging Nehru or the new government of India. Now, the legitimacy of both the government and of Nehru was so immense after the 30 years of struggle for independence that there's no question. Here I am bring you why this is so important is the comparison with both Weimar Germany and Russia and Soviet Union. Weimar Germany, as you know, suffered from extreme lack of legitimacy from amongst the conservative establishment, the ICS equivalent, as it were. The Prussian aristocracy, the army, the civil service, the judiciary were all hostile to Weimar Germany, not only because it had come after defeat, but also because there were so many socialists in it. Now, and they collapsed to an important degree, in part because of the undermining by these people. In India, there was no such danger whatsoever. In Russia, again, after the revolution, you had the case of the army officers being recruited, the old imperial army officers being recruited. Now, and invaders. They were kept under tight control, under tight leash by the commissars. In a sense, Nehru, having taken over these people, kept everybody under control. He was the boss, gave them the instructions as to what foreign policies to follow, and he did not take any foreign policy from Vajpayee. I don't think so. At least you haven't indicated that. He might have had provided this idea of alignment with Britain. That's something that Nehru firmly repudiated, and it continued that way. And he gave the guidance right through. So it doesn't look as if Nehru was helpless, or that he had no foreign policy, and therefore that he needed them. The policy that he followed, of course, is the non-alignment one, which you have suggested is a non-policy, which seems to me an extreme statement in itself. Let me not go further into that. I think Zorawar can elaborate on it if he chooses to. But the other big point, a sustained thesis right through your book, this book and the previous book, is about realism versus idealism, and about rationalism versus emotional. This is a dichotomy I'm afraid I cannot agree with, and it is not satisfactory, it doesn't help analysis. You're suggesting that Vajpayee is a realist, Nehru, and so on, but idealist. This is why is he a realist? Because the others wanted a world without war. They wanted an opening to the left, to the communist states, and they were suspicious of the Western governments. Well, naturally, they just become independent of the Western, most important Western government. And Vajpayee is realist, why? In part because he is so virulently anti-communist. Should this be regarded as an aspect of realism? I have my doubts. Seems to be more emotionalism to me. And you also say that the idealists took over were in position until 1962, after which the realism. Well, it was after that the more opening to the Soviet Union took place, which you have generally argued is not an example of realism, more of emotionalism. Vajpayee's idea of an alliance with the UK and talking of it as security and with honor, or with security and honor, all British assets and experiences coming to India, is an extraordinary statement. India had been under British rule for 150 years, and he wants to continue the relationship. Surely that is not rational or realistic. Nehru wanted to break out of that, and you are calling Nehru amateurish for wanting to break out of that. His extreme prejudice against the Soviet and the Chinese for being ministers, even saying that he cannot bring himself to talk to the Russian ambassador, and so on. I find that extraordinary from a professional. If he cannot talk to a representative of a totalitarian state, he seems to be very much in love with colonialism and very comfortable with it. And all this not examples of realism at all, and therefore this contrast even not satisfactory. Vajpayee seems to me was completely trapped within the British Empire and gained a lot of experience within it. And Nehru guided him out of it, or instructed him how to perform as for an independent state. And Vajpayee did the job properly. I don't think he had the conceptual grasp or vision that Nehru had, and his extreme dogmatism certainly came in the way. So did Subimal Das. And if the ICS people were the realists, what about KPS Menon, who you would accept was one of the most brilliant of the diplomats, the most accomplished, and so on? But he was completely pro-Soviet, to the extent of almost repeating every Soviet propagandistic item, you would say. And finally, such an accomplished diplomat is the one who misled Nehru in the Hungarian crisis, on which you elaborated. Was that KPS Menon did so. It's not merely Krishna Menon, all right, who you might say would be misled. But what is KPS Menon doing? Why was he, a professional diplomat, making such an error? So it seems to be both ways. You cannot argue in one or the other. Both men were. And all that Nehru wanted was an opening outward, out of the British Empire system or the Western Alliance. And that is what is called by Vajpayee and people being emotional or irrational and guided by sentiment. It seems to me by far the most realistic. And when it came to Nehru taking decisions, which should be, you may consider, properly realistic, he kept Krishna Menon out of the picture in dealing with China, given the details. And he used the expression, clouded a matter of our relation with China, merely because China is a communist country. So if he could keep his favorite out of the Chinese exchanges, was Nehru not being a good judge of persons and realistic? Whereas you are always saying Nehru is not in any way. And although Subimal Dutt was so severe with Nehru, so severe with Krishna Menon over the manner in which he handled the embassy, the High Commission in London, and Krishna Menon was so angry with him, it was Nehru who upheld Subimal Dutt and even made him foreign secretary later. See, this dichotomy doesn't hold and doesn't seem to be helpful. Nehru used them all in their respective cases, capable of acting. And Subimal Dutt he took on, and Vajpayee also he took on. He saw his skills, but Vajpayee's ideas are all wrong as far as he was concerned. He was a man who came with a very bad past, who did propaganda against Indian nationalism. Such a man is not normally taken. So isn't it an aspect of extreme soundness of judgment on Nehru's part to have taken on such a person and being able to use him creatively in every way? You've inverted it in so many senses. Vajpayee would not be the one who made the policy, it was Nehru. And Nehru gave him the instructions as to how to make the policy. Now, one interesting detail I might point out about the whole book, the books, which are fascinating. Nehru had a very negative opinion about civil servants. I'm not saying whether he is right or wrong. He called them narrow-minded, limited in horizon, trapped in rules, obsessed with seniority, promotions, transfers, etc., etc. That's what many people say. And his actual words are, few experiences are more dreary than sitting with high-placed officials, both English and Indian, in that seat of empire. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but the immense detail you've given in both the books about all their lives almost seems to uphold this, demonstrate the validity of Nehru's point, that this is exactly what they were all the time preoccupied with. So much of the book so much of your researchers have given just those details. I'm not saying necessarily that Nehru is right. I think you can say these things about most people, not only about civil service. But your detailed research has actually produced all that. And last point, you've repeatedly said Nehru is a poor judge of persons. These people were not. Okay, and Krishna Menon is always used as the example of poor judgment. But what about his own choice of Vajpayee and Dutt? Wonderful examples of good judgment, I would have thought. And as a general point, Nehru always supported his subordinates. He did not abandon them. He did not dump them. He did not humiliate them, even when they were manifestly non-performing. He tried to shift them to some other position where he could get the best out of them. He followed Gandhi's rule: get the best out of people, don't dismiss them, and put them in positions where you can get something out of them. I have come across umpteen examples in the selected works of this kind, where other officials, or some official would say, so-and-so's performed badly, get rid of him. Nehru would say, no, move him to something else, or urge him to do something better, perform better. But it would never be in the form of a dismissal. Krishna Menon would be a good example of almost perverse support of her erratic subordinate. But that he supported so many others throughout his life in a similar way, because he wanted to support subordinates and to support people who were very, very critical of him, namely the army officers, who lost so much from India becoming independent. And it is part of defense folklore to call Nehru something of a bumbling fool. Nothing like you hear from the army about him. And he never said anything negative about the civil service either, in spite of people like Vajpayee having spent their time doing propaganda against Indian nationalism in Washington. Thank you. I think I've taken more than enough time. Thank you, Nirupama, for permitting me.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I don't want to address some of the points you've made because I'm going to ask Rudra to speak, but maybe after this, when everybody has spoken, I'll ask Amit to respond to some of the points you've made. Can I now request Rudra Chaudhury, please, to take the floor and make his remarks?
Thank you, Ambassador Rao. First, I'd like to thank the ICWA for inviting me to this panel. Sorry, I'm just trying to see if I can be heard in things. I think it's okay.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Second, many congratulations to Amit. It's a comprehensive, insightful, and it's an extraordinary effort, I think, to capture a story of Indian foreign policy that, frankly, needed to be told. I should also say that this is an amazing time for writings on the quote-unquote Indianization of the services. I think for students and observers of Indian security and foreign policy watching this, I would in fact highly recommend reading Amit's account of the ICS alongside Vipul Datta's fantastic new book on the Indianization of the armed services. Much like what Amit has done on the ICS, the EAD, and finally the MEA, Vipul has done the same with regards to the creation of new military institutions, from the IMA in the 1930s to the NDA in 1949 to finally the NDC in the 60s. And in fact, it's interesting because there's a common theme that runs across both accounts, which gets away from more nationalist accounts of Indian foreign and security policy. whether you agree with it or not. But I think it's an interesting account to observe and debate. Data shows clearly that the antecedents of India's military institutions hark back about 100 years or so to an ecosystem created via the school system by the Lawrences and the St. George's and the Chiefs of Army schools. Amit shows that the idea and reality of independence, in his view, can be traced back to administrative processes, challenges, and administrative politicking in the first 5 decades of the 20th century. What you see, perhaps, is the faint outline of some thinking about Indian foreign policy. Now, whether or not you agree with Professor Palat, who just kind of made his position quite clear, and perhaps these officers, obviously, I mean, they were hired by Whitehall to do Whitehall's work, and whether or not they furthered Whitehall's interests, the officers in question, according to Amit's analysis, show that it is possible and perhaps inadvertently jet-started a process of Indianization. And I think none of those officers would have necessarily agreed with that label or term. And I think that point is well made in the thesis. And I think it's a powerful point. There was no vision, no clear objective, and no conceptual arc whatsoever, as Professor Palat also mentioned. But I still think that the book shows that a pale but crucial strand of what would become an independent foreign policy emerged in the first decade through very different and captive stories that Amit, I think, tells very nicely. The focus on maverick officials in Amit's book is much welcome. As Amit outlines clearly in the second part of the book, in the post-independent period, these were the Nehruvian rears, but only to an extent. His book clearly shows that the word of the Prime Minister was contested, challenged, adapted to deal with the crises of the hour, and this is clear in a numerous number of archives, not just in the ones that have been chosen by Amit. And what he clearly shows that foreign policy never is a one-man show. And I think what Amit does with the depth of history is to recreate some of those crucial controversies, discussions, and contests to process in dealing with a whole range of questions. In a sense, this is foreign policy from below, from the side, and not always from the top. And for me, I found the pre-independence years fascinating. The debates with regards to the position of Indians in Ceylon, South Africa, Fiji, parts of it were new knowledge to me, and I think that's a great credit to a book to create new knowledge. The brief section on the women's agitation in Fiji, for instance, between roughly 1915 and 17 during the war years is fascinating. It outlines the story of women's rights, progressive politics, and the roots, as Amit says, of a genuinely Indian agitation. And I think till date, and in most accounts of the genesis of Indian foreign policy, the focus has been on the anti-colonial conferences of the late 1920s, the semi-independent delegation to the League of Nations, the relative influence of those like Einstein, Tagore, who of course warned against the trappings of hungry nationalism, and George Bernard Shaw. Many of us have recounted those stories in our own kind of contributions in whatever limited way. Sarvapalli Gopal's own accounts fixate on Annie Besant, the Theosophical Society, the India League that met across the road from the present Indian High Commission in London, and of course the omnipresent role of Krishna Menon, contested from his time as a publisher onwards. But I think it is in this vein that Amit provides a refreshing challenge to the genesis of Indian foreign policy. The analysis around the Department of Education, Health and Lands, or the DHL, is unique, and its effects on the large parts of the empire is filled with examples of, as I said, a faint, contested, yet perhaps an early start to inadvertent Indianization. And I think this, for me, is what makes this work distinctive and makes a genuine contribution to a field of analysis, hitherto, frankly, obsessed with Nehru's universe, literary exceptions, and correspondences. And I really like Nehru. So I say that, with that caveat in mind, that clearly, and as Amit shows, only provides a view to the making of India's foreign policy. But in the spirit of constructive criticism, and in contrast to the deep research on the pre-independent years, I found the analysis of the post-independent years somewhat, frankly, underwhelming. The primary reason is what I would have liked to see some engagement, Amit, of an astonishing set of revisionist accounts of Indian security and foreign policy produced in the last decade and a half. And you've been part of this process. You know exactly who I'm talking about. But I think engagement with those texts would have brought out a richer story and a much more multi-layered story of Indian foreign policy post-47. And I think this engagement, in my view, would have helped temper the examinations of the roles played by Vajpayee, Menon, and Subimal Dutt, your protagonists. Indian foreign policy did not become less realist when Vajpayee left office. Frankly, that's just not true. right? In fact, archival records make clear that despite his position in the MEA, some of the hardest decisions from Kashmir to Korea were made in spite of Vajpayee, right? And, bits and pieces of this analysis is available in a number of works. Paul Maga, Srinath Raghavan, Rakesh Ankit, Tanvi Madan, Manjiri Miller. And it is this range that shows that the foreign policy decision-making was just a lot more complicated, potentially moved towards a top-down kind of format in the early 1950s. And it was a lot more contested, but not necessarily for the reasons that you posit. And I think given the depth of the work that is already available in secondary source, it would have been nice to see you deal with those alternative approaches a little bit more, to make it a little bit more challenging perhaps for the reader, in what is clearly a significant contribution. And I think the Korean crisis is a good example. Vajpayee, in my reading, to be honest, had almost zero role to play with the Korean crisis. It was B.N. Rao, Krishna Menon, who put India on the map. If anything, it was KPS Menon who had an early role to play in Korea during the partition in the post-Second World War period. The United States, which is a chunk of some of your analysis, despite Vajpayee's quips that the Prime Minister made relations difficult and he was uncomfortable with the Americans, it is also clear that the actual visit in 1949 and the processes that followed was a lot more successful than those like Vajpayee himself would have chosen to believe. So I think the different available readings in the archives of the correspondences with American envoys like Henderson and a range of others would have given your text a degree of complexity and challenge that would have made the contribution even stronger. But that said, it's a fantastic contribution. I really enjoyed reading it. Just 3 quick points I'll just make on, or rather 2 quick points. I think reading Amit's book, it becomes more and more clear why archives are important, right? But also becomes clear why context is important. There's a global history of events that take place, and why kind of using archives across the board. And there I'd say is that, Amit, I don't know, has Girija Shankar Bajpayee's papers finally been deposited in Teen Murti, or is his family still fighting this issue? Jagat Mehta's papers, his sons are in public life. Are they available in Teen Murtis? And if not, they should be, because that's the only way in which we can not only recreate history or create history or take the first draft, but complicate history and do exactly what Amit's doing and continue to do so, which is to look at history not just top down, but bottom up, sideways, and from a multitude of factors. And I think there's enough archival evidence. Just, if you don't mind, on Professor Palat's one point, is the 50s wasn't Nehru's decade. That's very clear. There were push and pull tensions today. There was parliamentary tension. There were economic tensions. And I think that has become much more clearer because of archives and because of the revisionist accounts that are available today. So I just hope that Amit's work jet starts many of us and students of history to continue doing what he's doing, but perhaps with a broader engagement of a field that's getting pretty rich and that already exists. So why ignore it? Thank you.
Thank you, Rudra. And I agree with your point that the field has become so much richer today with the availability of primary sources, new papers, and I recognize the need for more and more of such material to be made available to young scholars, to this new generation. When I look back at the landscape of research as it existed about 30 years ago, when I was actually dealing with China in the Foreign Office, there was nothing available. And when I came to write my book, which I've just completed, and looked at the material that I could consult, that the archives had opened up considerably, but not completely. And I think that process of opening up, that process of glasnost, as it were, when it comes to studying and understanding our past, must continue. I'm certainly a votary of that. And I see your point about Amit could have spent a little more time discussing the post-independence evolution of foreign policy, the role of the various players, and how important geopolitical issues were handled. But maybe that offers scope for a further study, Amit, and you might like to address this briefly when we finish this discussion. I also think that we attribute to Girija Shankar Bajpayee a certain almost a Deus ex machina quality, that he had he knew everything beforehand, and I don't think that's exactly the case, because even when it comes to the situation concerning Tibet after the invasion by China in October of 1950. We all talk about his reaching out to Sardar Patel, the letter of Sardar Patel to Prime Minister Nehru of 7th November 1950, and the work that Mr. Bajpai put into that. But when I look at the records, when I look at his meetings with Ambassador Loy Henderson, when I look at his discussions with the British ambassador, and you see a latent confusion even in Bajpai. How do you respond to this event of such magnitude, which is going to impact the situation of India's northern frontiers so deeply? I think it's, to attribute that degree of clarity in a situation that was extremely befuddling and extremely uncertain, and something that India was completely unprepared for. I think Bajpai was also affected by that. And I think when we write the history, we should provide for that kind of objectivity, because it's very fashionable, I know, to blame Nehru. I don't belong to that school of thought, certainly. I do not blame Nehru for all that happened. I think the benefit of 2020 is very convenient for all of us, but I think we should detach ourselves a little to understand that we need to comprehend the past a little better. But I'll go on now to Zorawar, who is our last speaker, and after which we can open the floor for questions if we have time. Zorawar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the ICWA for this absolutely terrific event. I think we've had really discerning and perceptive observations, and this work, I congratulate you, Amit Das Gupta. It's a fine piece of research. You prompted me also to sort of re-engage with which is what is going to be an ongoing research endeavor in a program, and for bringing to life some of the leading policymakers below the apex of political power in British India and independent India. I think for too long, the historiography of India's foreign policy has dwelled on the leadership of a political authority rather than on the more complex dynamic of interaction within small groups of advisors that typically shape the conduct of foreign policy making in India. In my own work, I can say, which covered the period from the 50s, 60s, 70s, I was at the outset quite conscious that I wanted to try and understand a bit more about this leader-advisor dynamic. It shaped the reading of the archives and how we could reconstruct, or how I attempted to reconstruct the decision-making setting and the influence of ideas and strategies that drove policymakers during those years. So we certainly need more of this research. We need more understanding of the internal debates, assessments, contestations. And I think we're going to see a very interesting collaboration, I hope, intersection between historians and political scientists who, as was alluded to, can also rely on the rich secondary literature as well as a growing expanse of primary archives that are becoming available. Of course, there's still a lot of inconsistency in the documentary material for students out there, for researchers out there, inconsistency both in asymmetry between the personalities. The Prime Minister from the 50s left us an enormous reserve of documentary material, and when I went from there to the 60s and 70s, it becomes a completely different research strategy. How are you trying to bring any kind of a scrutiny into the decision-making setting? And luckily, Nehru's successors, Indira Gandhi's advisors, fortunately also left us certain documentary material quite at a very high level of quality, which allows us again to sort of look at those years. So it's been a bit of a lucky shot or fortuitous on how we can look at that, the first major era of the Cold War. I think the later Cold War years, as we move back, increase our distance from the 1980s and perhaps even the late 1980s, late 70s, will also, I think, offer some interesting avenues for research. The other aspect that stood out in the structure of the present work was the recognition of the influence of the pre-1947 period, both in terms of ideas and personalities. I think it's quite evident the mainstream historiography has amplified the break of 1947 and declared it as something altogether new. So it was interesting to see a blurring of what is sometimes presented as sharp breaks in history. Now, that being said, the relationship between independent India's foreign policy and its perspectives on world order with the ideas that held sway during the British Indian epoch is a complex one. It's quite possible that the pendulum could swing in either direction. That is, one could claim India's foreign policy was entirely a strategic inheritance of the Raj, or take the nationalist view that post-47 rulers broke with that preceding period and formulated a new blueprint. The evidence for both claims exists depending on where and when we look. So it's vital that when we as researchers, historians, political scientists are very sensitive to how we are bringing that, because you can make an argument either way. I'll give you some illustrations. So, for example, on Tibet policy, we might notice extraordinary continuity in the late 1940s with, let's say, what Mr. Curzon was doing a half a century before. You then have a temporary break of the early 50s. You have this agreement between India and China, which suggests that India is now going to take a new approach to its northern, its territorial sort of special privileges that it inherited from the past. You then again see a reincarnation of the bold British Indian approach by the turn of the 1950s. So it depends when and where you're looking, right? On the policy towards the Soviet Union, we see an echo of the old cliches and prejudices of the Raj being espoused, sort of parroted by Indian officials right through the 1950s, only tempered by time, geopolitical circumstances, like the blowback on the Kashmir dispute, the sudden recognition of the value of the Soviet veto and geopolitical support, the US-Pakistan alliance, the China crisis. And suddenly you see the Soviet factor emerging in a very realist light. And ironically, who are those realists, right? They were not necessarily the protagonists of this book. So even on the approach of the Himalayan kingdoms, for example, you can see a tension between the old and the new. We could find numerous illustrations of an interplay. You look at the Nehru's conversations with his envoys on the ground, whether in Bhutan, Nepal, Sikkim, and you can see the incoming and outgoing telegrams almost characteristic of what may have been going on between London, Whitehall, and Delhi and Calcutta, probably for a century before that. So there is this, so making compelling arguments for either claim, I think where the notion of a break becomes compelling are the dramatic changes in the structural setting of the late 1940s. I think the world of the Raj was a very different world. The landscape changed dramatically by the late 1940s. The Cold War is broken out. The level of geopolitical shocks, even in South Asia, with partition, the rise of China. You have an entirely new political geography that's come into being, and you have a superpower dominated system that's out there. So I think we once we become conscious of that context, we will. I'm sure even British Indian policymakers, had they been around, would have certainly adapted the policy doctrine. And that's exactly what Indians went on to do in the 1950s. They responded to absolutely earth-shattering events and reoriented India to assume a new role. I'll come to who played a part in that role. I will allude to some of that. And I suppose this exercise of a role construction that Indians have been doing in the 1950s remains incomplete, because if you look at the debates today, they really are very similar to what was happening in the late 1940s and 50s. Where should China stand on China? Where should India stand on the India-China dispute? Where should it stand between the great powers? What should it be its positions on certain regional issues? What should it be its role in the subcontinent? So there is a lot of continuity of the conundrums that even British Indian policymakers face. Indians would continue to face that. It's how they responded and the prism that they approached to perceive and then formulate policy responses. So whose worldviews mattered? I think this book perhaps took a certain line, at least it suggested, in in trying to sort of go, and I think the pendulum might, Amit, have shifted the other way in this. So I see a lot more a complex engagement, and I think the importance and the dominance of the new political authority, I think, still remains. And so let me quote from Nehru in 1938 on what he says about the ICS cadre. I quote: "Self-satisfied and self-sufficient, narrow, with fixed minds, static in a changing world, and fully unsuited to a progressive environment." Of course, now this is Nehru in a radical part of his intellectual journey. There's no doubt about that. But the basic instincts of the protagonists of this book they were genre or officers which were really selected to maintain the old status quo. I think it's been alluded to by some of my colleagues here. Their most formative years were spent in looking at the world through British eyes and in the pursuit of British interests. I don't think they denied it. I don't think the Prime Minister ever denied it. The question was their virtues as chroniclers of events and people, and exposure to the world of diplomacy was quickly recognized by the Prime Minister as the sheer dearth of talent and experience in the early years of the Republic became apparent. So now that's a question of efficiency and bureaucratic abilities. But to claim that Vajpayee and co. were the makers of New India's foreign policy is, I believe, a stretch too far. To suggest that Mr. Subimal Dutt redefined India's China policy in the late 1950s also might just be overstating and also understating some of the structural forces that are happening out there, which perhaps even the Prime Minister didn't control. You have a crisis in Tibet. The Cold War is going through new churnings. You have the Sino-Soviet dispute. You have the United States re-looking at India far more seriously. I mean, look at the Eisenhower outreach to India. So there's a whole host of a geopolitical matrix out there, and that's when India-China relations undergo one of their downturns, so to speak. And we've seen these cycles play out for several decades and even recently. So this is not to say, of course, that the assessments and impressions of Girja Shankar Bajpayee or KPS Menon or Subimal Dutt at different times from their telegrams, which are available for us to see, were quite interesting, sharp, and informative. There's no doubt about that. But I think the question, at least that interests me, and I think interests many observers who are trying to get to the genesis of India's foreign policy, what was the deep DNA? We're talking of the origins, and I think for that we need to look at the intellectual influences. And for me, I still sort of would tend to go with the possibility or the assertion that the Prime Minister and his close advisors. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that it was not a one-man show. He relied on many officers, many advisors. Krishna Menon, of course, the leading one, and I think even Mr. Bajpayee, Dutt, KPS Menon. You had a whole range of actors out there who were strategically leveraged and employed by the Prime Minister for the pursuit of India's foreign policy. But what was the broader set of the vision and goals? So I'm not going to get into, let's say, the peacemaking role that Nehru and Menon constructed, right? That was a powerful doctrine, and my book, in fact, is a sort of an attempt to bring it out in a framework that does not succumb to sort of idolatry or just give it all to Nehru. I think there's an element of critique there as well. But I think here I'm going to focus on the idea of decolonization and the search for a new international identity. I think for India after 1947, after partition, it will become a strategic necessity to give it that sense of identity in the international space, to complement the process of national liberation. This ideational challenge, we may mock it today. We may place it in that it was all rhetoric. Where was the power? But the fact is that India needed the clothes for its sovereignty, more so given the unusual cooperative transfer of power from the colonizer to the new sovereign authority. Let's not forget, and we can see this from the record, many major powers out there, both in the third world, in Asia, were not looking at this new India in a sense of legitimacy, credibility. Is it truly an independent force? So I think That's where the contribution and our assessments of the first generation must be. That the rhetorical skill, the ideological language was not the forte of the bureaucrats that were inherited from the previous regime. That had to come from the nationalist leadership at the time, warts and all. And I do not think there's any doubt about the division of labor between the political leadership and the book's protagonists when it comes to contributing to this most strategic of objectives. That's the way I look at it. The construction of an Indian identity and role in the world. So to conclude, I would say the question of the main intellectual and ideological influences of India's foreign policy will remain an evolving research program and continue to draw interest on scholarship on India in the years ahead. I also think as our contemporary situation continues to evolve and go through a lot more churning, because we're seeing multiple power shifts happening today. They may not be as severe as what we saw in the 40s and 50s, but they're quite similar in terms of the basic breakdown of an old international order and a transformation taking place. So that's where I think works like Amit Das Gupta and a broader range that's coming out there will allow us to look back at those previous episodes. And I think our perspective on history should not be linear. I think if we look at a cyclical version, we might even find certain merits and lessons to be drawn from, let's say, British policy in Afghanistan in the late 19th century, or how they looked at the frontier with China and leaving it ambiguous, right? So there are also positive and negative lessons to learn. So I think there's enormous merit in looking at the pre-1947 period, but it must be understood and dealt for in its own terms. To try and create a linear sense of lineage, and I know that perhaps gives modern Indian institutions like the army, the civil service, others a certain prestige attached to it. But I think it's important to be conscious that the onset of sovereignty for India and the constitution in 1950 and the dramatically changed context is and did pose a sharp break. So how you draw upon the British Indian phase and the legacy has to be modulated. And the idea that, let's say, Curzon or the stuff that was happening in the late 1900s, where the British Empire was colliding with the declining Qing Empire in the northern Himalayan zones, I think those lessons should not be taken the wrong way. The balance of power was different. I think India in the 1950s, given the balance of power it faced, did actually quite a remarkable job until the crisis with China sort of went away. So I think the period of the 1950s is also an important lesson. You constructed an international identity, you produced security, you had a frontline state on either side of a frontier. Let's not forget NATO, the United States has entered South Asia and built up Pakistan to a peer military rival. You engage in a balance.
Zorawar, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we are going short of time.
So I'll probably close there and just say that the idea of a cyclical perspective of history, I think, will give us enormous fruits, both from a policy making and a research perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zorawar. They were extremely pertinent remarks. And the cyclical nature of history, I think that is a point we all need to ponder about. But I'd just like to say, from the viewpoint of a practitioner, somebody who had worked within the corridors of the Ministry of External Affairs, what are the lessons to be learned from this history that Amit has provided to us? The role of the early professionals in the Foreign Service, and especially those in leadership positions, the qualities of their experience, the qualities of character that they brought to the profession, their capacity to understand what was going on in the world around them, the powers of calibration, adjustment in a very formative period, not only of the foreign policy making, but also of institution building. You see, the Foreign Service post-1947, a young service, it had to be built from scratch. And there is no doubt in my mind that Jawaharlal Nehru was a key player. He is really, call him the tragic hero of those times, but he really, the mold that he made for foreign policy during those years. And the effect, or the Nehru effect, even to this day, in as far as our outlook to the world is concerned, is something that we cannot deny, despite all the very toxic debates that go on to this day about what his role was and how he could have done things differently or how somebody else would have done things differently. So histories like Amit's, I think, are extremely valuable. We need more research of this nature. And we need more understanding, particularly within the cadre of professionals in the Foreign Service, knowledge of this history, knowledge of the importance of studying the archives, and to learn from the examples of the past, whether there were mistakes, whether there were successes, but to carry that within us, because that is really our legacy. So I will ask Vivek now about whether we have any questions from the audience or whether we should ask Amit to respond to the points that have been made in the discussion.
Ma'am, we have one question, but while we are at it, I think we can go for a wrap-up round of comments and responses especially from Dr. Das Gupta. And then there's just one question, so we can come back to it later.
Sure. So, Dr. Das Gupta, Amit, would you like to respond to the points made by Professor Palat and from Rudra and Zorawar?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the extensive comments on the book, most intriguing. And I would like to start with a comment on what both Rudra and Zorawar observed, which is very true. This is a one-sided book. So it's not a full-fledged history of Indian foreign policy of the Nehruvian years, and it was never intended to be. So I have focused on the ICS impact, and also the Dutch biography I've authored a couple of years earlier is the perspective of one individual. So there is a much broader picture, I fully agree, and but there I would have had to publish a series of books if I wanted to include that, and that was not my intention. And Rudra, you're very right. This is work in progress because there's so many books published in recent years, and there's so many more archival materials available. So, as we all know, it takes a while from completing a manuscript to bring the book into print. So I concluded my work on this manuscript in late 2018, and then the Nehru papers were open, and I spent a visit to Teen Murthy, but there were so many researchers working on these that I just got a few files. And therefore, I had to rely on the excellent work of Professor Palat. The selected papers, you have done an admirable job in completing the series in no time and given a wonderful fundament to researchers. Still, I didn't see the Nehru papers, which are more detailed, and I didn't see the Krishna Menon papers, which are available now. And there's a number of books I've missed because I noticed them too late. So just to explain this makes a one-sided book. And then I would like to give a few comments on the points Professor Palat raised. So is it foreign policy in the colonial period or not? So I don't claim it's identical with the foreign policy of a national state, independent India, but it has many aspects of this, in particular, if you see the interaction with South Africa. So we have two roundtable conferences, and the key players are Srinivasa Shastri and Vajpayee, two Indians, and they discuss the status of Indians in South Africa. But there are many aspects coming into that economy. There's discussion of an embargo against South Africa. There's security aspects when the Italians occupy Abyssinia and so on. So if India had been independent then, those conferences wouldn't have been much different. And I think this is true for other cases in the colonial period. We have missions abroad, we have agents abroad, which are not called, who are not called ambassadors, but function very much like that because they are not limited to economic issues, but they're in full political debates on franchise and interstate relations. Second point, that analysis of Vajpayee from early 1946, and in the book I've discussed the intentions behind this report, and I regret, but I don't agree with your assessment, because in 1946, Bajpai has no friends with the British anymore. So I've written the long chapter on how the people who called the shots, that is Olaf Carrow in Delhi and the India office in London, they did everything to reduce Bajpai's influence, and Bajpai knew that independence was close and he had no future with the British for sure, and he also knew he had no future with the Congress at that moment, because he had made himself, as you said, most unpopular with anti-Congress propaganda. So maybe it's lack of fantasy to say that the only option is a partnership with the United Kingdom, but by exclusion, if you exclude the US and exclude the Soviet Union, and if you claim like Bajpai that China can't be the true partner because it's another weak country, then it leaves the UK, and the idea is of course not continuation of colonial rule, but the idea is Indian Ocean is on Asia, is Indian business, the Atlantic and Europe and North America is the British business, and India will profit from the know-how coming from the British side, and the British by India's size and influence in Asia. So it's a very different story from the colonial period, where one is dominating the other. The idea is a partnership, and I wouldn't say that Bajpai tries to please anyone with this document, because there is no one to please at that point. About the input of the ICS, yes, I've said that Bajpai's influence on Nehru is remarkably low. So he discusses, he presents different ideas, Kashmir, China and so on, but he can't convince Nehru. But the one who is winning over Nehru is Dutt, who is very much a disciple of Bajpai, though has developed his own ideas by 1955-56. And Zorawar, you have made the point that I have overstated the point, the role of Dutt convincing Nehru to change the course in the China policy away from that Tibet agreement, the Panchshila, and that is confidence in somebody you don't really know, and you don't know his intentions. Bajpai is a key player, and of course we have G.B. Pant here, whose role, however, is not documented anywhere I've found. So there's a number of books emphasizing his influence. So I took what I had, and these were the Dutt diaries and the huge collection of originally classified papers of the MEA, and this makes this story. The Potter non-alignment, Professor Palat has touched that in the passing only, I described as a non-policy, and saying there's something you should not do, that is forge an alliance with another country, leaves thousands of options open otherwise. So it's excluding one aspect of many, but it's not giving positive guidelines, say we are going to pursue this and that formal policy. And I've quoted Nehru from your edition of his selected papers in 1946, where Nehru writes to his sister, not the exact wording, so I have no idea what line of foreign policy to pursue. We should get an idea about it. And that's what his sister is complaining, that she has no guidelines in the United Nations. And the story continues, and in more detail in the biography of Shubhi Maldat, I've elaborated on two cases. One is the China affair, and the second is, of course, Hungary, where we see a diplomat on the ground in Budapest, Emir Rahman, who is sending most accurate reports, and three people who don't believe him, so they have no idea what's happening on the ground. KPS Menon in Moscow, far away, Krishna Menon in New York, and Nehru in Delhi. So how comes that you ignore a report of your own representative in a country who is an eyewitness? So this takes weeks, not days, 3 weeks altogether, until Nehru is convinced that the reports on the events in Hungary are not fake news by the Western powers to divert attention from the Suez crisis. And here we see, and I understand that you must defend Nehru for your very position there, that Nehru in a number of cases had emotional responses, and I take realism is the basic idea of realism, that you try to get a maximum objective picture as far as possible, and then you draw conclusions what to do. And both in the Dutt diaries, who is a deep admirer of Nehru, but also very critical about his decisions in foreign affairs, you see that Nehru had an idea how the world should be, and that was mostly his guidelines. So this makes the major difference. It's never black and white. It's not that Nehru has been not realistic at all. He has been in many cases, but in some crucial cases he has not been. And whereas Bajpai, as Madam said, is the always calculating, rational person who is always analyzing a situation, trying to keep out whatever emotions. You see that in many internal discussions in the colonial period, and then tries to draw a conclusion, and that is trying to be the same. He's not always that neutral. And one last point about non-alignment in Indian foreign policy guidelines. So I've published a journal article about India's stand towards the two Germanys in 1949, and so West Germany is recognized, East Germany is not. And this draws extensive internal discussion. And then it turns out that people say, what does non-alignment mean in that case? Shouldn't we recognize both sides? Others say, no, non-alignment means we should decide according to national interest, which lies with West Germany and the Western powers for the money and the support we need from them. And this continues into the 1950s. In many documents of the MEA, you see that neutralism is used as a synonym to non-alignment. So I've never found a clear definition what non-alignment actually means. So the one thing it says, no alliance with anyone else, but this is not a foreign policy yet.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part. I think there was a problem with the Wi-Fi. Sorry, Vivek, I missed what you were saying. Did you say something?
Yeah, no, ma'am. I was just saying that in the chat box there is a comment from Rudra and there's a question from T. Hassan. If you click on the chat box.
Yeah, I'm just. Yeah, go ahead, Rudra.
No, don't worry about my comment. It's just a random comment for others, nothing else.
Okay, Vivek, would you like to read out the question then, please?
Yes, ma'am. So Tasadduq Hussain, I think, asks what's sacrosanct about the years 1923 and 1961, which is covered in the book.
Amit, would you like to answer that, please?
Well, I think it has not been so sacrosanct, but it just has been that, as Rudra has said, that nobody had this department of education and health and lands on the screen. And other people scholars have used the materials for other purposes when they were researching conditions in Malaya or Kenya, but there's never been the attempt to understand this as a department pursuing a certain policy. And I think I had the advantage, thanks to the ministry and also thanks to Shubhriya Gua, to see some materials which had not been accessible earlier. These are the diaries of Shubhi Maldat, which are very detailed, and particularly the one for his foreign secretaryship is very, very interesting. I think they're all available now with Timurti. And also thanks to the ministry, I had special permission to work in the internal archives of the ministry. But I can assure you that thanks to one of your successors, Sujata Singh, there has been a major effort to transfer these materials to the National Archives, and this has happened a couple of years ago. And there's an excellent database provided by the MEA, which permits scholars worldwide to search in the database of the National Archives, which is indeed the database of the Ministry of External Affairs, and find out what materials are available. So the once special knowledge I had is now available for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Amit. Anupam, would you like to say anything about the points that have been made? Since you are in the ministry and as a practitioner, you're in the thick of it, would you have any comments to make? You're muted. Sorry, can't hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. It was fascinating to hear a group of international scholars describe theoretical aspects of the initial years of our foreign policy, and some of the points are really very, very relevant to how we frame our policy issues today. Whether we are realists or whether we are liberals or whatever we are, some of the parameters in which we make our policies remain constant. So the points that Zorawar raised, for instance, about whether our policy is a continuation of imperial policy or whether there's a break, or what that break is I think something which we need to talk about very, very carefully. The points by Professor Palat about civil service and about if what Zorawar says is right, then is it did we make the right choices at that point of time? That's what that's the question that came back to me over and over again. We were very young as a nation now. I mean, Pandit Nehru's sole experience at that point of time, I think, was a couple of international conferences, other than, of course, his enormous intellectual ability, which comes out in the form of his books and so on. I mean, what we did not, for instance, have the kind of even in the military, when you look at it, the senior most Indian officer at that time was Brigadier Cariappa, and the sum total of his experience was commanding a brigade at that time, and he replaced General Auchinleck, who was the British had armies and navies and continents and oceans for 200 years by the time we became independent. So how do we know at that time what was the right thing? And how do we take those decisions is something which all the very eminent scholars, Rudra talked about. So did we make mistakes? What are the consequences of those mistakes? How would we have done things differently? Could we have done things differently given the paucity of resources that we had, intellectual, manpower, knowledge? The knowledge of statecraft, you can't grow statecraft overnight. Statecraft takes, a tradition of statecraft takes hundreds of years to grow. I think that's a point that perhaps Amit could study in his next book. That's all. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, ma'am.
Thank you, Anupam. I think coming from somebody who is, actually in the thick of it, engaged in the execution and the formulation of critical foreign policy, your remarks are extremely relevant and should be taken very, very seriously. Once again, since we have run out of time and gone over, the actual period stipulated, I'd just like to thank Dr. Amit Das Gupta and all the panelists in our discussion today for the remarks they've made, for the points that they have raised, certainly points to ponder on, to debate on in the future. And I hope that practitioners in the ministry are listening carefully to all this debate around them. And I hope it will enrich the work that they are doing. And most of all, I commend Dr. Das Gupta for throwing light on a very important and relevant period in the formation of our foreign policy. The role played by individuals like Mr. Bajpai, Mr. Menon, and Mr. Dutt in a very nascent period of our history, and what we as diplomats of the country can learn from that example, from that professionalism, from that sense of loyalty to their leadership, their capacity to contribute to the debate, to enrich it intellectually, even if it was a Nehruvian foreign policy or a Weltanschauung that we were thinking of or talking about. the contributions of these personalities cannot be overlooked and should not be underestimated. And on that note, I'd like to say goodbye. Thank you very much to the ICWA for bringing us all together this afternoon for a most relevant discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. With that, let me just move on to the vote of thanks. On behalf of the Indian Council of World Affairs, I thank the chair and panelists for joining us today and offering their valuable thoughts on this important publication. Thank you, Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao, for chairing today's session. Thank you, panelists, Dr. Das Gupta, Dr. Anupam Ray, Professor Palat, Dr. Rudra Chaudhury, who had to leave early, Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh, for taking out time for reviewing the book and for your valuable comments. My sincere thanks to DG ICWA for his initial idea to hold this discussion on a very important publication. My sincere thanks to the ICWA administration, led by Deputy Director General Somen Bakshi and Joint Secretary Nutan Kapoor Mahavar for their support. Many thanks to all my ICWA colleagues, led by the Director Research, Dr. Nivedita Ray, whose support was critical in putting this program together. Lastly, sincere thanks to the IT section in ICWA, the designer and all other staff members involved leading up to this event. With this, I formally declare this program closed. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you.